Hello, good people, and welcome to today's lesson. So, we are in the middle of Unit 1, and thus far we've talked about types of government, power and authority, and how power and authority is interpreted in different ways and produces types of government. We've talked about the four functions, we've talked about origins, Magna Carta, English Bill of Rights, and colonial regions. And now we're moving into the ideas that go into government themselves. So, why the types of government look the way that they do, and how that whole thing of what should we do about power, what should we do about authority, how do we split it up, how that begins to take shape in the colonies. So, let's get to it. Please make sure that you have this in your topic for today on your note sheet. It should say Principles of Government. Don't worry about this small thing down here. You don't have to write that anywhere, but please make sure this bold section, Principles of Government, is the topic for today's notes. All right, so first and foremost, we need to talk about the Enlightenment, because we talked about colonists and we've talked about other individuals who are technically not colonists who still reside in the colonies, the things they brought with them, the ideas they brought with them, and their idea of self-government is what we're going to focus on today. So how in the world do they just get these grand ideas about governing themselves and being like, listen, King George III, we're not going to do what you say, and here's why. We have to figure that out. But first, we've got to go flashback all the way to the Enlightenment in the 1500s. Please let me know what you remember, because there is a question coming up. All right, so you should have remembered something about the Enlightenment. It happens across Europe from about 1500 to almost all the way into the 1700s, mid-1700s. And this is the time when people are starting to reject the idea that the church and religious values are the only way that you think. They start to place an emphasis on science and on physics and on the natural world rather than on God. We have a bunch of people like these five guys who kind of give us ideas on how governments should function. And a lot of these old dead white men have gotten ideas about how government should work based on what they have seen fail in their own governments. They're like, listen, we watched this terrible thing occur, so here's how I think you should fix it if you make a new government. So the first idea that we've got is the idea of self-government. So the colonists already have this idea in their head that since the king has really left them alone for about 150 years, they've had the ability to make their own laws for themselves without interference from the king. So this is the ability to govern yourself. Our two colonial examples of this are the Virginia House of Burgesses and the Mayflower Compact. So the Virginia House of Burgesses is our colonial example of a representative democracy, because you had to be elected by the people to be in the House of Burgesses. And in the Mayflower Compact, everybody on the boat voted. So that would be a direct democracy, since the entirety of people were allowed to vote. That's our first thing. Our second thing is separation of powers. So as time goes along and the colonists see that, I think that we should split up power and authority amongst people so that no one person has too much power, like the king that we dislike right now. So we decide to split power into three branches so that no one group or person becomes too powerful. Okay, we don't want one person who has too much power. We want to split it up into three branches. Our three branches are up on the wall. You should know these, and if not, we have written them down on your intro note sheet. They are the legislative branch, who makes laws, the executive branch, who enforces laws, and the judicial branch, who interprets. All right, our third thing is equality and rule of law, okay? So equality, obviously we know what that is. Everyone is born the same, not necessarily with the same amount of opportunities, but the same amount of possibilities in their life. All right, so the rule of law is the next one. This one you might not be quite as familiar with. This one means that everybody has to follow the law and nobody is above it, including the leaders of your nation. So if everyone has to follow the law and nobody's above it, nobody is free of being held accountable for their actions. Everybody has to be accountable for the things that they do and the things that they say. So this particular idea is kind of how we base our entire representative democracy, with everybody being equal. Because if we're not going to enforce the law equally across all people, we might as well go ahead and be a monarchy and let the king do whatever they wanted. All right, our fourth thing, don't stress out. You can paraphrase, okay? I know it's a lot of writing. The fourth one is the social contract and consent of the governed. So you have participated in a social contract before, and you know what consent means, even if you're not sure of the word itself. So a social contract is an agreement between the government and the people. And if you have a contract, you have at least two sides, and both sets of people have to hold up their side of the agreement. Okay, so the government says, you know what, we're going to protect the people, just like we talked about our four functions of government. They're going to protect you and provide you with security. They provide order so that when you step out onto the street, the purge doesn't happen every single day and you get shot to death going to the corner store for some Takis. Okay, that's not something that you want to occur. So the government has to provide that. And then in exchange, the people give their consent to be governed. So they say, listen, you've made protections for us, you've made order for us. We agree to try our best to abide by the rules and follow the rules, and we give our consent or permission to be governed. If I were you, I would write over my margin right now where it says consent, consent equals permission, okay, just in case you forget. All right, the next one is natural or unalienable rights, okay? These are things that you are born with. Natural rights is what we're going to call them. You need to write the second word because that's how they're going to phrase it on the final exam. They like to use the word unalienable rights. This just means that you can't take them away. So here's the thing. If you want, you can just write the ones on the left-hand side. It's up to you. So John Locke is a philosopher. He's basically just a big thinker about government. He has a lot to say about the government, and he is British, okay? So he was alive many, many years ago, and he says the three rights that any person, well, he says man because he's a man, all right, anything that a man is born with, it would be life, your right to your life, your right to your liberty or your freedom, and the right to your stuff, okay? So life, liberty, and property. The way I choose to remember this is that you put a lock on your property. So if you want to draw a little padlock on the side of a property, I'd strongly suggest that. Then Thomas Jefferson, when we write our form of government called the Constitution later on, he takes two out of the three of these and steals them and then puts his own spin on it. And he said, okay, yes, except for I think we have the option for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Not necessarily stuff, but the pursuit of happiness, however that may look for you. All right, the sixth one is limited government. I just want you to write government does not have absolute power, and we just cut it off right here at the comma, and you don't have to write anything else. So government does not have absolute power. Our particular form of government, that's a representative democracy, has multiple ways that we limit the power of people in charge, but in general, limited government just means it doesn't have absolute power. All right, so since you probably told me that you didn't remember a whole lot, which is false because I know that your world history teachers taught you really well and taught you all four of these men, okay, we're going to keep it moving to our philosophers. So when we start thinking about how governments should function, these four guys show up the most in any discussions the colonists have about how government should work. So John Locke is our first person. He writes about natural rights, and we get an entire paragraph from the Declaration of Independence just from this guy, okay? And again, he says natural rights, and he says life, liberty, and property. Those are his three natural rights he thinks that every person is born with. And again, the people on your final exam are going to call these unalienable rights. They are the same thing as natural. Don't let that trip you up. The next person is Baron de Montesquieu. Please make sure that you try your very best to spell his name correctly on any future tests or quizzes. I will not count off for spelling, however, calling him Monty or calling him Mosquito Man is not going to get you a whole lot of points with me, just saying. All right, so he writes about the separation of powers into, dun, da, 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 I hope you know because there's a question coming up. Okay, so if you wrote that he writes about the separation of powers into three branches, you would be correct. And if you didn't, that's okay. We'll fix it. Okay, so this guy, when he is 2 years old, first of all, he is a noble person in France, okay, which means that his family owns a lot of land and is in charge of a couple of villages, collects taxes from them, yada, yada. So he's about 2. He gets kicked out of his super fancy royal mansion, And then he goes to live with a peasant family and he learns a trade, okay? I'm pretty sure he had to be like a blacksmith or something, like learn how to work with iron. And so he lives there in this teeny little hut as a peasant until he is 15 years old. And then once he's 15 and he's learned a trade, then he is allowed to come back into the fancy mansion where his parents live and the rest of his family to start trying to take over for his dad. So he has both lived like a peasant and like a noble person. So when he starts making laws about how government should function and how his particular town should function, he does so with the knowledge of how people who are lower classes than him live. So he's kind of experienced both ends of the spectrum, which makes him a better leader. So he writes about separation of power so no one becomes too powerful. And the last two guys write about the same thing. So if you want to go ahead right now on your note sheet and just be mindful that Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes both write about the social contract, but they have two different ways of going about the social contract. So they say, yes, the government should do one set of things and the people should be able to give their consent to be governed, but they kind of have different ideas about how it works. So Rousseau, I'm going to zoom in here just a little bit, okay? Rousseau, this is what you need to put under Rousseau. All right, if the government does not uphold their end of the contract, overthrow it and make a new one. So it rhymes, Rousseau, overthrow. If your government does not hold up their end of the contract and they're not providing order and they're not providing security, in his mind, it needs to go and you need to make one that functions for you. Okay, so that's Rousseau's version of the social contract. His focus is more on the people and their responsibility and less so on the government. Now, Thomas Hobbes, on the other hand, totally different. Thomas Hobbes is a British guy, whereas Rousseau is French, okay? So Rousseau has seen multiple kings and queens get slaughtered. He has seen a lot of rebellion, and he thinks that if your government is terrible, uproot it and make a new one as many times as you need to. Now, Thomas Hobbes lives in a relatively absolute monarchy. He has seen kings and queens of England who have ruled with pretty much an iron fist, and anything they say, like anything they would have said, went, okay? And Thomas Hobbes thinks that that works for the people. He does not trust the people with their own intellect, okay? He doesn't think that they're smart. He thinks people are stupid. So he says, once the people give their consent to be governed, and they say, yes, you can govern me, the government then has absolute power over them because he believes that people cannot be left to their own devices, okay? So again, Rousseau and Hobbes both believe in the same thing, but they go about it in a different fashion. Okay, and we have got some quotes that we are going to put into our notebook for you to work on, but this has been Principles of Government.